I've always been worried about the word university in this context, because this U3A, I never thought it was, but it occurs to me as I was preparing this, and the history group has been going for 15, 16 years, quite a long time anyway. And in the history group, I do, I suppose, probably just over half of the talks, which means that in university terms, I have prepared however many hundred essays that is, or I would have thought that a presentation like I do for history is worth a seminar at university. So I've been at university for quite a long time in modern terms. And the only other thing is that, by way of introduction, one or two of the things that I'm going to say have resulted from talks that I have given to the history group. And the poor old history group, we're going to have to run through all this again in the next few months as we analyze it in more detail. But it does mean that I'm not used to spouting endlessly, because in history group, I sit around a table and everybody else contributes a lot. And that has made a huge difference. It really is valuable I do a little bit of research, and then people feed in their experience, places they've been, and so on. And other people do the talks anyway. So that's just by way of background. History has always been subject to interpretation, and there are whole streams of it, and we have all been influenced by it. I taught it for 30 years, and one of these groups is, I realize now, with hindsight, is what I was teaching. Yes. I've got 8 or 9 different interpretations or versions of history which have happened. And each of them is vaguely interesting, and each of them has, at one way or another, influenced your view of history. But they have certainly been influential. Classical history. Classical history was written down. Julius Caesar, for instance, gave a very full account of what he'd been up to. It was, you might say, a bit of a self-serving account, as are most biographies. And various people, and we'll come back to that again in a minute. Or actually, we could jump ahead and deal with it now. The biographical view of history is epitomized by Julius Caesar. So much of what we know, there are plenty of Roman historians, but the ones who wrote their own life stories, obviously, and particularly if you happen to have been Julius Caesar, and rather influential, important. And it has affected everybody's view of history. 2 further things to say about that. One, it is quite interesting from some of the other talks that I've given recently about the history of Germany, history of France. People like Charlemagne and a man called Clovis, who was an earlier ruler of France, well, France and Germany, somewhere in between, they all aspired to be Holy Roman emperors. They aspired to be like the Roman emperor. They admired, when we ask today, what did Rome ever do for us? And they wanted to go back to ancient Rome and rule the world on the Roman model. It was important to them. And then the other thing that it all came back, history, as we now know it, virtually revived in what we call the Renaissance, the rebirth of everything, that 15th, 16th century rebirth in the arts and culture altogether, when Constantinople fell and all the documents, all the Roman classical documents, it became in a fashion. So classical history, quite important in that sense. And then, moving on, the church was in charge of the writing of history. And all the history in the Middle Ages is written down by the church because they were the only ones who could write. Your version of events, your idea of King John being a baddie, and your idea of King Richard being a hero. Why was Richard a hero? Because he went off on the Crusades like the Pope wanted him to do. And what did John do? He raided the church funds and had the whole country excommunicated. So of course he didn't get a very good briefing in history while the church was in charge. So the church was dominant in that. I just wanted to go on a little bit. It was God-serving, obviously, and it was self-serving. The hierarchy were praising themselves and making sure of their own position in society. So anybody with any funny ideas could be silenced quite easily, out in a distant monastery or whatever. So, God said, and the Crusades are one example of it. The other example of church influence is their response to the Black Death and all those memento moris and so on. You go into any old cathedral and you see the bodies and bones and how powerful God was punishing. And why was he punishing them? And what was he punishing them for? Because they were naughty. And what were they going to do about it? They were going to flagellate themselves. So the church control of history lasted for probably longer than any of the other things I'm showing you. So it went through to humanism, and then instead of being the old Catholic Church in charge, it became disputed church. So your history is then influenced by whether it's Protestant or Catholic. And then other things chip in, other variations come into it. Hugely important. Right. The Enlightenment. In the 18th century, people began to believe, and some very... We would not be having this talk. You would not be discussing history. You would not be feeling about history as you do, even if you're not very interested in history. You have feelings about right and wrong. You have feelings that people have rights, that system, there are bits of what I'm telling you which you hate and think how awful it must have been. Well, in terms of judging things, in terms of human rights, in terms of freedom and equality and so on, all that stuff, all the things that we worry about and debate now, all the stuff about how to govern and be governed, whether the government is fair or corrupt and so on, it all goes back to the 18th century thinkers who were searching for, they believed that it was possible to get to the truth. They believed that it was possible to achieve wisdom and understanding, and that we were moving forward in those respects. So the Enlightenment influences our thinking. The next one, I gave a talk about this in the anniversary of Magna Carta, so that will be in 2015. The Whig view of history, where an awful lot of British historians in particular, sponsored by the CIA or whatever. Anyway, democracy, the idea of progress towards democracy. So you move from the Magna Carta to the Civil War and doing King Charles down and the Commonwealth and so on. That is progress. Then we have the great men view of history. Now, there are two things. There was an article in Times about it only a few days ago. The great man view of history. We all actually subscribe to the idea of great men. If I asked you who you thought was a great man, you would very probably want your great man to be a nice man. The ones we call great, Alexander the Great, conquered half of Asia. Peter the Great spread Russia in a Putin-like way from Moscow through to the Baltic. Catherine the Great spread Russia down through Ukraine to the Black Sea. They are conquerors. Alfred the Great actually sorted out and got to be closer to being a king of England than had been around for a while. So we very often use the word great. We most often use the word great for power and victory. But I'm still, who are the great men, who are the great people of our lifetime? Well, you want them to have done some good. You won't concede that Hitler was a great man, even though he did quite a lot of conquering. So your ideas of greatness are quite interesting. Our ideas of greatness. You have all sung at some stage in the last couple of weeks something which sent him victorious, happy and glorious. Others of you may actually have sung wider still and wider. So we are all complicit in that idea of greatness. The other bit I've given it to you. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. There is self-made greatness, and there is born, and so on. Anyway, think about when you're using the word great, and think about when you're using the word progress. In these descriptions, I have said progress towards knowledge, progress towards democracy, progress towards. Progress at one level means progress towards today. Everything that happened pointed towards where we are now. But there's a bias in our interpretation of progress that we tend generally to think that it's for the good, for the better. We usually use the word progress as though things were improving. Third one of the... I have to click twice, apparently. Right, go through this very quickly. Basically, there are more... I missed the last one. The last of those interpretations is the one which most of you who were subjected to. If you were alive at the time of the coronation, you were led to understand that you were part of the greatest family that had ever lived on Earth. 1/3 of the globe was coloured red, and this lovely lady was the fulfillment of everything that could be expected. It was wonderful. Anybody wish to deny that? Anybody who was around at the time of the coronation? Well, I can tell you I basically spent the next 30, not straight after that because I was only a little boy, but for another 40 years at least, I was teaching that version of history where the British Empire was the height of world achievement. We began to question it. I still hold on to some of those things. Sorry, you'll have to have another look when you're on the way out. I didn't do that. At least I didn't deliberately do that. Right, prevailing. Each of these have been influential. Marxist history, anarchist history. Anarchism, just to jog you, anarchism is not a question of throwing bombs. It is a question of believing that we can do without government. So the fact that they throw bombs was an effort to get rid of government and those who govern. But there is a serious belief, a serious philosophy that you can do without government. Wokeism, then we just go through, and I guess some of this is probably what some of you were expecting, and to an extent it is partly what we will be talking about as we move forward. At the end of it, do we compensate? Do we feel guilty? Should we feel guilty? They're facts. They have happened. They were created by our predecessors. And judgment is, I don't know, I'm not happy about compensations and handing things back. Right, there's another silly little, no, it's not silly. I hope it's not silly. Just a couple of more little definitions. Nominally, prehistoric things, prehistory, is what is not written down. There's either written evidence or there's archaeological evidence. There was either a written record or there wasn't a written record. If there was a written record, it's history. If there's no written record and you can do it only by research, it's prehistory. But that becomes a bit confusing because of the prefix pre, because classical history is largely written down. And then we have, after the Romans left, there's a whole long stretch of 1,000 or so years where there's not much written down. So you've got prehistory being post-classical. Just to undo a little muddle and have you think about it for a second. I want to go back to, so I think I've done that bit. The other things that have really, I've learnt in recent months doing the history of Germany and the history of France is how handy it is that Britain is an island. We have British history, all neatly self-contained, with a little bit of Welsh fringe. I'm an Englishman, I must be very careful what I say. I wanted actually to say that at the beginning. But English history, British history, even a slightly more dangerous bit of the Scottish history, which was separate, and some people would still like to be separate. It's all very self-contained. You know where you're talking about. With Germany, there was no such country as Germany, and to run through the history of Germany, the Holy Roman Emperors is probably as good sometimes they're based in Italy, sometimes they're based in Poland, sometimes they're closer to France, sometimes they're in Holland and Belgium, sometimes they're in North Germany. And it's not until 1871 and Bismarck that you can actually talk about Germany. Even France has been a sort of a one nation since Henry IV or so that's Elizabethan times, really, in our terms. But before that, you had your Burgundies and your Bordeaux and your Aquitaines, and there was always a little area around Paris, but it wasn't always the most important bit. And we, of course, were fighting for it. There's something else to be said about that in a minute. I'm going to leave that last bit about dates for now, if I do have time. This is, by the way, I should have warned you, this is a 4-hour talk. So I'm editing it as I go. I'm going to come back to the dates, I hope, if I have time at the end. Right, that's where you knew you were going there. William the Conqueror. He is a conqueror. He is king by right of conquest. He owns the land. And that ownership is something that we fail to understand today. It occasionally comes into a debate about the monarchy. We, most of you, are subjects. You belong, in Norman feudal terms, you belong to the king or queen. You're not citizens. French people are citizens. We are subjects of the monarchy. We belong. And what is strange, because most people actually hate William the Conqueror. Most people see him as being what he actually was. He was a bastard. He was illegitimate. One of his amazing achievements, back to those questions about greatness, was William the Conqueror a great man? Well, he was certainly hugely influential and self-made. How somebody from his position, protected through his childhood by his uncle, becomes the Duke of Normandy, and then the challenger and the man who conquers. And one of the things that I'll come back to that in a minute. He was a ruthless slaughterer. But we are also at times, certainly at the time of the coronation, which you're going to be hearing a bit more about next talk, at the time of the coronation, Charles is proud to be the heir of William. And everybody, our kings, our queens, are descended from William the Conqueror. It's touch and go whether they're descended from some of the others, but if they weren't descended from William the Conqueror, they would not be claiming the right to the throne that they are sitting on. So it is a key fact. So he is an outstanding, history-changing character. Might is right. This is the sort of thing I was talking about when I said about the Enlightenment. You are all uncomfortable with that. You are particularly uncomfortable with that every time you switch on the news at the moment. Might is right. We don't like it. But it has been a fact. It is probably a fact still. It's a fact that we don't like. But we shouldn't let the fact be too disguised. It may be wrong, it may be evil, but it's true. And the other thing is that it is admired. There are a lot of people admiring the President of the United States. There are almost nobody able to speak out and say that they don't admire the president of the of Russia. We are guilty of moral relativism. We make up. So, okay? This was them and us. Just a little silly footnote that don't know how aware you are, but the French regard William the Conqueror as having been French. So they conquered us in 1060. You don't think that, do you? Of course you don't. We were conquered by a Norman who was of Viking extraction and marginally French. He was, in fact, fourth or fifth generation that had been living in France. So anyway, when you go around the Bayeux Tapestry, the French are showing you that they conquered us. But, of course, we've never been conquered since then, and we were only conquered then by a nasty Norman. When you think back to your ancestors, you're not Norman, are you? If you had one of the names of the 12 knights, 12 Norman knights on the estate and around town, you're perhaps proud to be descended from the Normans. Otherwise, of course, you're Anglo-Saxon. You wouldn't possibly be defended from this rotten lot, these slaughtering people. We go a little bit inverted on some of this. If you play around with Who Do You Think You Are, which is such a popular program, initially you would expect that people wanted to have been descended from somebody important and noble, and that's what they were looking for. In the meantime, they have learnt that it's quite fun to be descended from somebody not quite so noble. There's a murderer in your family. Well, that's a bit of a laugh, isn't it? There's some very nasty, or there are some really sad victims. So instead of, who do you think you are? Harry Enfield was considerably richer than you. Since then, we've had lots of sketches where I'm considerably poorer than you. So just in terms of looking back, and the last one, that's Thomas Jefferson down at the bottom there. Thomas Jefferson, one of the great founding fathers, the third president of the United States, in my book, a great man advancing democracy. And so, a slave owner, Washington, was a slave owner. He should be chucked in the river, shouldn't he? Religion. I think I've got everything up there, but how important it was. William the Conqueror's brother was Bishop of Bayeux, who did the Bayeux Tapestry. And if there are too many in the family, which is something we'll come back to, then a role in the church. By the 18th century, if you were in the nobility, the oldest son will inherit the title. Otherwise, it's an option between the church, the army, and the navy. And you can buy them a commission, so they become an admiral, or you can buy them a see, so they become a bishop. Or anyway, that's the way to spread the family and make sure that everybody's looked after and secure. I think I'll just let you read that little list and think about it, how important and how different. I know I shall not get to my later slide of religion, but the other thing I want you to think about on this one is talking to your grandchildren. And increasingly, as I was a history teacher, it became difficult to get the kids to understand the Reformation when Elizabeth I and Mary were squabbling about whether the wine was blood and whether the wafers were flesh and whether it mattered. And of course it mattered. So there are two things to say there. One, it's all different. In terms of rewriting history, our understanding as a generation, because we did generally, most of you understood that stuff. Your grandchildren will not understand that stuff. Your grandchildren aren't sure whether Joseph was a man with a coat of many colors, or the father of Jesus, or not father of Jesus, or the man who buried Jesus. 3 Josephs, and I'm sure you can think of more. It is all very different, and in that sense, it needs rewriting because it needs re-explaining. They, of course, know an awful lot about some of the other religions, which we have discussed occasionally in the U3A, but our grandchildren probably know more than anybody here. Marriage. Quick, I don't think there's much to, if you read that one through, goes together like a horse, till death do us part. This is an old version of marriage. This is marriage until our lifetime. Our views on it have changed. Or maybe our views on it haven't changed. Maybe your views, you're quite happy with most of that. There's a generation coming up which is less comfortable with some of that. Anybody want any explanations of any of those? All those things were part of marriage until our lifetime. Contract for life, divorce, annulment, rape, marital rape. Not something that people could even contemplate. I mean, it couldn't happen in generations in the past. But it did. Adultery, civil contracts, same-sex contracts, in vitro fertilization, adoption, infant mortality, the age of consent. Infant mortality should have been on the earlier slide. I think it was at one time. The age of consent. But just to bear in mind as you play with that, it's almost more difficult because kids were growing up more slowly for most of history. They were not becoming adolescent until later in their teens. It changed. This is a bit more complicated. At one stage I had this under the marriage label. Part of the contract and a very important part of the arrangement in marriage, in life, was that both parties accepted the need for children. Marriage was about having children, but both parties accepted it. The ladies accepted it as much as the men. All right, there were, as I put it there, double standards. And it is now fashionable to paint the whole thing as a patriarchy where the men were in charge and so on. But the women were just as complicit. It was part of the understanding that when you got married, you were to deliver the babies. And marriages were arranged and fixed and all that stuff. But the whole point of it was to deliver the babies. And there's some stories there which I want to just run through. On the left is Matilda. Matilda was the first, she inherited the throne. Her brothers were drowned on the White Ship. There were 2 brothers who should have been, the older one should have been king. The other one should have been king if he had survived as well. They didn't. She was the only heir of the king, Henry I. As a little girl, she had been married to the Holy Roman Emperor and gone to Germany at the age of 8 and lived in the German court and been treated as the empress from the age of 8 into her teens when her husband died. So she was available when she inherited, but she was more German than she was British. She was and she was a disaster. She's the first effort at having a queen that we have had on these islands. And she was a disaster, and her cousin and most of the nobility wouldn't accept her as a woman, but she made herself pretty unacceptable as well. But the point of having gone off at the age of 8, think about it. The next one, that is Richard II, the one who lost the throne, the one who did the peasant, dealt with, as a boy himself, dealt with the peasants' revolt, boy king, dealing with peasants' revolt. Boy king, read your Shakespeare, divine right and all that. That is his second wife. He'd failed to breed with his first wife, or perhaps his first wife had failed to breed for him, in the light of the way I was putting it just now. This time, he's married an 8-year-old. It's rather sweet, actually. It's not quite as horrid as it sounds, but it gives you pause for thought. Her job will be, when she grows up, that that picture, he is reported as having treated her as a sort of little niece and been very sweet and lovely with her. There was an age, there's a papal decree which says that they could start breeding at 13 or 14 or whatever. But in the meantime, just thinking about different times. The next picture is Charles II and his wife. A lot of this comes from a series which I did on Queen's Consort, and it's very interesting, complicated stuff. Poor old Catherine of Braganza failed to deliver. And we know it was on her own account that she failed, because Charles rather succeeded all over the place and filled the House of Lords for you. Next one is Anne. And everybody knows that poor old Queen Anne delivered 16 babies. 1 or 2 of them survived to the age of 2 or 3. The others she had a lot of miscarriages. Very sad. And her life, basically her health took the impact of 16 pregnancies as well. And the last one, when I talked about double standards, that is King George I, whose wife had an affair. This is before he was king. She was never Queen of Britain. She had an affair, and he murdered her lover and locked her up for the rest of her life. So when he came here, he was without a wife and famous for having several mistresses, including the beanpole and the elephant. The elephant and the beanpole. Anyway, he was allowed to have, quite publicly, to have these mistresses while his poor old wife is locked up in Germany, in a castle. Right, double standards. Slavery. Throughout time, slavery, there has always been slavery. Of course, post-Wilberforce, post-Enlightenment, we all believe it is wrong. We hate it. And we've got very heated about it. It has become confused with race, because the American version of slavery, or the Atlantic version of slavery, the most recent version of slavery, is complicated by that. But there are other things as well throughout time. That serfdom, when we go back to the William the Conqueror bit, the lords of a manor then owned their peasants. When we go back to the marriage bit, I don't think I covered it properly in the marriage bit. I did the marriages at the top end, at the royal end. I didn't do the marriages at the bottom end, but they were arranged. The way out of some of this arranging, and it may be that that is why we had so many wars and things, was to go off to war. But basically, William the Conqueror owned you as his subjects. What was the advantage of having loads of subjects? One, they all had to raise their taxes, and he went the feudal system. He went from the lords of the counties to the lords of a manor, and they all raised the money. They also, when you want an army, you go to the regional dukes and earls. They go to the lords of a manor. The lords of a manor go round the village and round up the young men. And that may be the way that marriage became a bit more exciting, because otherwise, within the framework of the village, there's a limited gene pool, and the lord of the manor is in control. You would need your lord of the manor's permission to marry. So it's all controlled. I'm running through there other things which are nearly as bad. I've mentioned serfdom. the exploitation in the Industrial Revolution, when we had those child laborers and so on, the conditions were often worse than slavery, because a slave owner at least had an interest in, you were his possession, so he was responsible for you. If you're living in the slums and working in the mills or working in the mines and it all goes wrong, there's nobody taking responsibility for you. There is an escape, and if you're lucky and things go well, you are no longer a slave. So slavery is, the bondage of slavery is worse, but the conditions. And then, we have sweated labor. Stakhanov, did Stakhanov mean anything? Stalin used this man, Stakhanov. He gave him a nice coal seam and told him to dig as much as he could. And he then became the model example for everybody. So all the people, all the miners in the Stalinist 5-year plans had to live up to, or most of them failed to live up to, the perfect conditions. So they were subject to pay reductions and punishment and so on for failing. It's all based. So that if you hear and then we have people smugglers, and I don't think you need telling about them. The mountain, the presidents on the mountain in Rushmore, 2 of them were slave owners. Washington, and I've said that already. Government, monarchy. Throughout our early history, monarchy was the accepted order of things. It was God's order of things. Everybody believed in it. The kings began to believe in it even more. Divine right. There's a sense in which divine right even makes sense. If you were born to be king, you were born to be king, and that was your fate, your destiny, and God was behind it. Well, most of us also were born to be the sons of a particular family, and there were some requirements that came with it. That was our destiny. We were born to be. So there's a sense in which it makes sense. But when you can make too much of it quite clearly. The accepted order, the natural order of things. Primogeniture, that's the oldest son stuff. 1 or 2, including Charlemagne, including William the Conqueror, they failed to pass it on to the oldest son. They tried. Charlemagne's achievement was getting half of Germany under one man, his own, control. That's why he's a great ruler. And then he split it over the next couple of generations. It all fell apart again as it went to the different sons. Try Henry II, who got a pretty good control of it all, but his sons were Richard and Geoffrey and Henry and John, and they all fell apart again. And he spent half his reign stopping his sons from squabbling. So is it better? The weakness of the arrangement is if the oldest son turns out to not be the cleverest or the best for the job. And it quite often, particularly by the time you've spoiled him as being the one who, the special one, doesn't always work out. The wars that happened, the subjects thing, the subjects are cannon fodder, and they're also fundraisers for the revenue. And what are we doing? We're fighting the 100 Years' War. Or we're squabbling with the other half of the Wars of the Roses. We're Lancastrian or we're Yorkist or whichever, and we're persuading everybody to fight for us. And what's it all about? Well, the wars that you know about and that disapprove of now have some sort of basis in ideology, or we're trying to conquer because we're better rulers than you are. We can run your country better than you can. This is nothing to do with, there's nothing ideological about it at all. This is my family's right. My mother was the Princess of France, so of course I should be the King of France. Right. It changed. Things moved on. We had a parliament. We had an urban middle class who weren't prepared to put up with this. We have the arrival of printing. We have So that's going backwards, as we say, tax raising, conscription, billeting, all those things. What was unpopular in the Civil War was exactly those things. Charles had the problem of taxing people, of raising an army, but also of feeding that army as he went around. What could you do about it if you were unhappy? Well, you could emigrate. You either consented or you emigrated. That was the other serious possibility. That's how the first settlers went to the States. It's how some later settlers went to Australia or were sent to Australia, to emigrate. Question. The right to rebel. Who has, and at what point do you have the right to rebel? Well, those dates are significant. 1649, we executed the king, thus proving that we could survive without monarchy. In 1776, the Americans declared themselves independent. They didn't like taxation without representation. They didn't like George III. If anybody's seen Hamilton, you can... So, first big rebellion, first failure of monarchy, execute the king. But monarchy survived. There's a restoration and lots of other bits of progress. 1776, the Americans. 1789, I've given it's difficult to know which date. I could have given you 1793 when the French executed their king. But basically, bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. Everybody was very excited. The Ancien regime had been such a bad monarchy that it needed replacing. We have Tom Paine saying that. We have Hobbes saying that monarchy is the best system because without somebody in charge, life is intolerable, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Can't live it. Locke comes up with the idea that we can consent. It is government by consent. So he's one of the founding figures as we move towards democracy. You have Paine, Tom Paine, The Rights of Man. He ended up in America. He supported the American colonists, but he's also involved in the French Revolution and a citizen of France. And for what it's worth, the man up the road, Richard Price, thank you very much. I knew it. My big fear is giving this talk for the first time, I was going to forget a name. Thank you very much. One Richard to another. Richard Price, citizen of France, champion of all these things, big figure, a big historical figure, far too little known, born in Llangina, rector in London, and a big influence there. The founding fathers and so on. Why Burke and Shakespeare? Edmund Burke is the one who turned against the revolution. He'd been a supporter of the American colonists. He was quite a progressive man, but he'd said that revolutions never end up where they're meant to be. They always get out of control. He predicted, while everybody else was still excited about what was happening in France, he predicted that it would all turn rotten and end up with a new dictatorship, which was fulfilled by a man called Napoleon. As far as I'm concerned, Napoleon's quite a good guy, but he nonetheless was a military dictator. And by the time he was in charge, all the countries of Europe are worried about this revolution getting out of hand. Why Shakespeare? If you just think about the Shakespearean tragedies that you know, and even most of the Shakespearean histories that you know, there is something goes wrong, somebody is overthrown, and it doesn't lead to where you wanted it to lead. Julius Caesar is murdered, and the idealist, the wonderful Brutus, doesn't get what he wants. We end up with something just as bad. Republic was supposed to be go through Richard II. He's overthrown, and it all goes wrong. Go through any of your Shakespearean tragedies, the overthrow, and it all goes wrong. So, I don't think Shakespeare, basically, the stories he's telling are stories of where revolutionary acts and overthrows lead to trouble. Right. Am I all right to go back to that dates thing? I hope so. This is just a little exercise. I said about prehistory, and it isn't what it says. I said about our island status making it much easier for us to have a nice little straightforward history because we are nicely contained boundaries. I wanted to just play with dates. I'm good at dates, but I have never learnt dates. I've never sat down and learnt dates. I know dates because they're part of a story, and so do you. First date I want you to play with is your own birth. And in my case, 80 years on, rather a lot has changed. And just in terms of thinking about it, I can date the dates I know relate to my life. I had my son in this year, Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, blah, blah, blah. And you get those dates. And you know dates. But you never learned that they're part of your story. And the other thing to think about, starting with your own birth, if like me you are 80, then 80 years before you were born takes you back to 1865. Now, anybody born in 1865 was 60-odd by the time of the First World War. If I expect my grandchildren, I haven't got any, but that's beside the point, you expect the younger generation to think about Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was a hero 80 years ago. When I was in my teens, nobody expected me to get excited about Palmerston. Just think about that for a moment as you rewrite your history. The other one, this is classical. You've all got a central date for classical history. In the reign of Caesar Augustus, it came to pass. What's supposed to have happened? It's inaccurate for what it's worth. Jesus was not born in the year 0, but that's a complication. But it gives you a central slot. 400 years earlier, you have Alexander, 315, you have Alexander the Great conquering Persia. You have Socrates bringing philosophy into a measurable founding, really, Western philosophy. 300 years later, you have Constantine, the Emperor Constantine. So you've got a 400-year span in either direction, going back to Greek history and coming forward to the end of the Roman Empire, or roughly the empire falls apart. What were Cleopatra's dates? When did Cleopatra live? Well, Cleopatra had affairs with Caesar, Julius Caesar, who is just before Caesar Augustus, and she then had an affair with a man called Antony and Cleopatra, who is part of he loses his civil war to Octavius, who becomes Augustus. So it's just before, in the 50-odd years before 0 AD, you have Cleopatra, Caesar, Antony, Augustus. in the reign of Caesar Augustus. So I thought that was just a little exercise, have you all thinking, and you can do it from your own lives, backwards and forwards and so on. So I hope, I don't know if I've rewritten, but I hope I've given you a bit to think about, and roughly that's it. Okay.
Thank you, Andrew. Questions? Anyone? A canter through history.
Only thing I'd like to ask is if somebody conquers, if someone conquers and yet you own that land, surely you still own it. Like you said about when people.
Sorry, the question is, if someone conquers and you own some land, what happens? And the answer is, it's up to them. I mean, he may allow you to be the sitting tenant. He'll probably ask you to sign something nice in his favour, or he'll kick you out.
So that is the basis that Putin is taking over Ukraine.
I don't know. I mean, basically, when you've conquered somewhere, you have to make an arrangement with the people you've conquered. And it depends who and how you are. I mean, you can do it. You can go to Greenland or you can go to Denmark and talk about it.
And no royalty claims to be descended from the conqueror, but they don't mean that literally, do you? Because we've been through Germans and all sorts of people. I mean, there is some tenuous here with people like Princess Diana. But the main links must have been broken on numerous of them.
That's a wicked aspersion to cast. Are you casting an aspersion? I mean, basically, it is extremely unlikely that it's all been legitimate all the way through. But the theory is that it has. I mean, basically, when we went to Hanover, the Hanoverians were the next best heirs, other than the Jacobites, and we didn't want the Jacobites, so we disinherited the Jacobites, and we went across to Hanover, even though George I was a rather charming character, as I just told you.
People, some tenuous link back to the conqueror.
King Charles would not be there if he was not descended from, he was not tenuously descended from, well, I mean, it's a question of legitimacy, or otherwise there may have been some misplaced, but...
You only said we all laugh over
that's less legitimate, but probably true.
Andrew, what influence would the women in these great men's lives have upon history? There's not much mention of them.
No. That, I mean, in a sense, that's implicit in some of what I've said. Some of those queens were extremely influential, and some of them weren't. And some of the peasant wives undoubtedly controlled their husbands in their little huts, which they were sharing with the animals. I think it's down to individuals, but their actual position in society was not, you wouldn't have liked it. You know, basically, when they married, the husband owned everything.
Andrew, it's interesting, isn't it? You said in historical terms, we think about history in terms of monarchs and great rulers, and yet we touched on Richard Price, who was probably one of the greatest minds over 500 years, and yet few people in this room really know who he is. And he had such a dynamic effect on the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and we've got a plaque on a toilet in Tangaina.
Well, you and I have been to a few exhibitions about him. There's a Richard the Price Society. But Gwyn Petty, the late Gwyn Petty, member here, used to give talks, gave a talk about Richard Price at one time, and had to explain at the beginning of the talk that he was not talking about the man who instituted cremation, whose name was also, the champion of cremation was a man called Richard Price.
His history just went down thing after another. or is there a direction to it?
Is history one damn thing after another, or is it a direction to it? It's a very bad time to ask that question. I mean, I hope I instituted some thinking about the word progress. And if progress is towards something, or is it just the story of how we got to where we are? I don't. I like to think, because I'm post-enlightenment, I like to think that there is some meaning. You know that I have sort of a profound faith in some sort of ideology and morality. So we in philosophy class, we differ about this. So.
Can I just say, just picking up that point, on behavioural patterns, I know you haven't been judgmental at all in this, Andrew, but are there any indications you would suggest from what we studied and what you open our eyes to, that maybe we should be seeking any behavioural patterns of morality that we should seek in good leaders in the future? Is there any pattern that we should find? We've seen a list, Chronology, of people behaving as they wished to establish power. Is there something that we should be seeking in our leaders at this very difficult time?
Greatness. Greatness in our interpretation, as opposed to the triumphant bit. When I go home, there are going to be a number of things that I have forgotten, and one of the things that I didn't mention in the course of some of you heard my talk about 20th century prime ministers, where I just run through them. And again, when I say I'm good at dates, I've never learnt dates. I kind of barely learnt those prime ministers, but there was a great big gap. I could run through British prime ministers from Walpole until the middle of the 1900s, and then I regarded that little lot as being rather boring. And in the course of something I did in a presentation a couple of years ago, I learnt that Derby and Aberdeen and Russell were great men. I admired them. So these were, and of course, part of their being, me dismissing them as being boring, was also the old class thing. Of course, they were all aristos. They were blimps, as far, Colonel blimps, pompous asses, whatever. But they weren't. They were great men who served their country, didn't need to. Derby was the richest man in the country. He didn't need them. We've been there since, actually, pretty rich. But he served, and they reformed. And a lot of the reforms were really against the interest of their class, but they believed in it. Russell wanted the people to be able to vote, and to vote it. So they were admirable. And I had happily dismissed them as being boring and, stuffy old, and they weren't. Salisbury was the first of my century when I did that talk, and I never really talked about him very much. I just saw him as being an aristo who was the last aristo to have the job. He was a great man. He served his country well. So I don't know what you look for, but I think you look for some deeper bit. And one of the things that Salisbury predicted was that when it was open to everybody, these other people have got to make a living out of it. And we do see evidence occasionally that they are making a living out of it. I think it's time. Thank you very much.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed.